Nothing bad happened. That's what makes it so confusing. By every visible measure, things are going well, maybe better than they've ever gone. You made the change you needed to make. You grew. You left behind what wasn't working, became a little more yourself, moved toward the life you actually wanted. And yet, underneath the progress, there is this ache you can't explain. A heaviness. A sadness that has no obvious cause. You feel like you're grieving, and you have no idea what for, because nothing went wrong. If anything, everything went right. And still you're mourning something. You might be tempted to dismiss it, or to worry that something is secretly wrong with you, that you must be depressed or ungrateful, or incapable of being happy even when your life improves. You look at the good things and feel the grief anyway, and the mismatch makes you question yourself. How can you be sad when everything is finally going the way you hoped? What is wrong with you that you can't simply enjoy the growth you worked so hard for? Carl Jung understood exactly what this is, and his answer will change how you experience it. There is nothing wrong with you. You are grieving because growth is a form of loss, because every step toward who you are becoming requires leaving behind who you were, and the self you are leaving behind deserves to be grieved. The sadness you feel is not a sign that the growth was a mistake. It is the necessary, unavoidable mourning that accompanies all real transformation. And once you understand why, the grief stops being something to fear and becomes something to move through on the way to becoming who you are. Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, understood psychological growth in a way that was far deeper and more honest than the cheerful, frictionless picture our culture usually paints. For Jung, real transformation was not a simple matter of adding good things to your life, of becoming better while remaining fundamentally the same. It was a profound process he understood through the ancient symbolism of death and rebirth, a process in which the old self must, in a real sense, die so that a new self can be born. Jung devoted enormous attention to the imagery of transformation that appears across mythology, religion, alchemy, and the dreams of his patients. And he found, again and again, the same pattern. That genuine psychological growth follows the archetypal sequence of death and rebirth. The old way of being, the old identity, the old structure of the self must be dissolved before the new one can emerge. There is no rebirth without a death first. There is no becoming without an ending. The caterpillar does not simply add wings, it dissolves almost entirely in the chrysalis before it becomes something new. And human transformation, Jung understood, works the same way. To become who you are is to let who you were die. This is why growth feels like grief, because it is, in part, a kind of death, the death of a former self. When you grow, when you genuinely transform, you do not simply upgrade while remaining the same person. You leave a version of yourself behind. The person you were, with their familiar patterns, their known identity, their particular way of being in the world, ceases to exist, or at least ceases to be who you are. And that person, however much you needed to grow beyond them, was still you. They deserve to be mourned. The grief you feel is the natural response to their passing. Jung understood that this is one of the most overlooked truths about psychological development. We imagine growth as pure gain, and so when it brings grief, we are bewildered, assuming the sadness means something has gone wrong. But Jung saw that loss is woven into the very structure of growth. Every genuine step forward involves leaving something behind. Every new self is built on the death of an old one. And the person who is growing, precisely because they are growing, will grieve, not because their growth failed, but because their growth succeeded, and success in transformation always carries a death within it. Interestingly, modern research on grief points in a similar direction. Grief specialists have increasingly recognized that mourning is not reserved for death alone, that human beings grieve many kinds of loss, including the loss of a role, an identity, or a former version of themselves. The end of a defining chapter, the shedding of an old self-concept, even a positive transition that requires becoming someone new, all of these can activate a genuine grief response. What Jung described through the symbolism of death and rebirth, contemporary psychology recognizes as the very real experience of grieving a self, a role, or a life stage that has ended, even when nothing bad has happened at all. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. To understand why growth produces grief, even when everything is going well, it helps to look at what is actually happening, both in the psyche, as Jung described it, and in the brain, as modern neuroscience increasingly understands it. The two pictures reinforce each other in a striking way. Jung understood that the self is organized around a certain structure, an identity, a set of patterns, a way of being that gives us a sense of continuity and coherence. This structure is not superficial. It is the foundation of our experience of being a stable, continuous person. And when we grow, this structure is disrupted. The old identity that gave us coherence begins to dissolve, and before the new one has fully formed, there is a period of genuine disorientation, a kind of in-between state where the old self is dying and the new self has not yet been born. This transitional space is inherently destabilizing because the very structure that made us feel like ourselves is in flux. Modern neuroscience offers a compelling parallel. One influential framework describes the brain as fundamentally a prediction machine, an organ that is constantly building and updating internal models of the world and of the self in order to anticipate what comes next and minimize uncertainty. According to this view, a great deal of what the brain does is maintain a stable model of who you are and how your world works, so that it can predict and navigate reality efficiently. Your identity, in this sense, is partly a predictive model, a stable set of expectations about yourself that the brain relies on to function smoothly. When you grow and change, this model is disrupted. The stable self-concept the brain had been relying on no longer matches reality, and the brain has to undertake the effortful work of updating its model, of building a new predictive framework for a self that has changed. And this updating process is experienced from the inside as discomfort, disorientation, and often a kind of grief. The brain, in a sense, has lost something it depended on, the reliable, familiar model of the old self, and it registers that loss much as it registers other losses. There is a further piece that helps explain why even positive change feels destabilizing. Research on the brain's response to uncertainty has found that uncertainty itself is aversive, that the brain treats not knowing as a kind of threat, sometimes an even greater source of stress than a known negative outcome. In one well-known line of research, people facing uncertain outcomes showed higher stress responses than those facing predictable ones, even when the predictable outcome was worse. This means that the uncertainty inherent in growth, the in-between period where the old self has dissolved and the new one has not yet solidified, is genuinely stressful to the brain, independent of whether the change is good or bad. You can be growing in exactly the direction you wanted, and the uncertainty of the transition will still register as a threat, still produce the discomfort and heaviness that feels like grief. What emerges from both Jung's account and the neuroscientific one is the same essential truth. Growth requires the dissolution of an old, stable structure, of self, of identity, of the predictable patterns the psyche and the brain relied on. And that dissolution is experienced as loss, because it is loss, even when what replaces it is better. The grief is not a malfunction. It is the felt experience of a self and a brain, letting go of what they knew in order to become something new. One of the most important things Jung understood about this process is the powerful pull it creates to reverse course, to abandon the growth and return to the old self, precisely because the grief and disorientation of transformation are so uncomfortable. Jung recognized that there is always a regressive pull in psychological life, a temptation to retreat from the difficult work of growth back into the safety of the familiar, even when the familiar was limiting or painful. When you are in the in-between space, when the old self has died and the new one has not yet formed, when you are flooded with an inexplicable grief and a destabilizing uncertainty, the temptation to go back can be enormous. To return to the old patterns, to undo the change, to reclaim the former identity that, however limiting, at least felt stable and known. The grief of growth can be so disorienting that retreating into the old self feels like relief. This is one of the central dangers of the transformation process, and it explains why so many people begin to grow, feel the grief and disorientation that growth brings, misinterpret that grief as a sign that they've made a mistake, and retreat back into the life they were outgrowing. They mistake the natural mourning of transformation for evidence that the transformation was wrong. They feel the death of the old self and panic, rushing to resurrect it, when the death was precisely the point, the necessary passage toward the new self waiting on the other side. The neuroscience aligns here too. Because the brain finds the uncertainty of the transitional state stressful, and because the old neural patterns of the former self are deeply established, while the new ones are not yet formed, there is a genuine pullback toward the old, well-worn pathways. The familiar patterns are, quite literally, the path of least resistance, the routes the brain has traveled thousands of times. The new self requires building new pathways, which is effortful and slow, while the old self is always right there, requiring no effort at all. This is part of why change is so hard to sustain, and why the grief of the transitional period so often drives people back to who they were. Jung's insight is that you have to be able to tolerate the grief and the disorientation without fleeing them, to stay in the in-between space, to endure the death of the old self and the discomfort of not yet being the new one, long enough for the transformation to complete. The grief is not a signal to turn back. It is the very experience of the passage, and the only way through it is through it. The person who can bear the mourning without abandoning the growth is the person who successfully becomes who they are. The one who mistakes the grief for a mistake and retreats remains trapped in the old self they had almost outgrown. Jung's understanding, reinforced by modern research, points toward a clear way of moving through the grief of growth, rather than being defeated by it. The work is to grieve consciously, to endure the transition, and to allow the new self to form. The first movement is to recognize the grief for what it is, to name it as the natural mourning of transformation, rather than misreading it as a sign that something has gone wrong. This reframe changes everything. When you understand that the sadness accompanying your growth is not evidence of a mistake, but the expected, necessary grief of leaving an old self behind, you stop fighting it and questioning yourself. You can say, with clarity, I am grieving because I am growing. This is the death that precedes the rebirth. Nothing has gone wrong. This recognition does not remove the grief, but it removes the second layer of suffering, the fear and self-doubt that come from misunderstanding what the grief means. And it allows you to grieve cleanly, without the added torment of believing your sadness is a symptom of failure. The second movement is to actually mourn the old self, to give the grief its due rather than rushing past it. Jung understood that transformation requires genuinely letting the old self die, which means genuinely grieving it. This is not wallowing. It is the honest acknowledgement that something real is ending. The person you were served you, protected you, carried you this far. They deserve to be honored as they pass. Take the time to recognize what you are leaving behind, to feel the loss of it, to say goodbye to the version of yourself that is ending. Grief researchers have long understood that mourning that is allowed and moved through resolves, while grief that is denied or suppressed tends to persist and complicate. The same is true of the grief of growth. Allowed and honored, it moves through you and completes. Denied, it festers and can pull you back toward the old self. The third movement is to tolerate the in-between, to endure the uncertain, disorienting transitional space without fleeing it. This is the hardest part, and it is where most people falter. When the old self has dissolved and the new one has not yet formed, you are in a genuinely uncomfortable space, and every instinct, psychological and neurological, pulls you to resolve the discomfort by retreating to the familiar. The practice is to stay, to recognize that the disorientation is temporary, a necessary passage rather than a permanent state, and to resist the powerful pull back toward the old self. Here, understanding the neuroscience actually helps. Knowing that your brain is doing the effortful work of building a new model, that the discomfort is the felt experience of that construction rather than a sign of danger, can make the in-between more bearable. You are not lost. You are being rebuilt. The fourth movement is to give the new self time to form, to understand that transformation is a process, not an event, and that the new pathways require repetition to establish. Here, modern research on neuroplasticity offers genuine encouragement. The brain retains, throughout life, the capacity to form new neural pathways and to strengthen them through repeated use. The new self you are becoming is, in part, a set of new patterns that become more established each time you enact them. At first, the new way of being feels effortful and unnatural because the pathway is new and the old one is deeply worn. But with repetition, the new pathways strengthen. The new self becomes more natural, and eventually what felt foreign becomes simply who you are. The grief of the transition gives way, over time, to the solidity of the new self. This is why patience is essential. You cannot rush the formation of a new self any more than you can rush the healing of a wound. But if you endure the grief, mourn the old self, tolerate the in-between, and give the new patterns time to establish, the transformation completes, and the grief that felt so bewildering reveals itself, in retrospect, as the birth pains of who you were becoming. The grief you feel even though nothing went wrong is not a malfunction, not a sign of ingratitude, and not evidence that something is secretly broken in you. It is the oldest and most human of experiences. The mourning that accompanies all real transformation, the death that precedes every rebirth, the loss that is woven into the very structure of growth. Jung understood this through the ancient symbolism of death and rebirth, and modern neuroscience, in its own language, describes the same reality, that to become someone new, the old, stable structure of the self must dissolve, and that dissolution is experienced as loss, even when what is being born is better than what is dying. You are grieving because you are growing. The self you worked so hard to move beyond was still a self you inhabited, still a home you lived in, still a version of you that carried you through everything you experienced up to now. Of course you grieve them. Of course there is sadness in leaving them behind, even when leaving them behind was exactly what you needed to do. The grief is not the enemy of your growth. It is the proof of it, the felt evidence that something real has ended so that something new can begin. So do not be afraid of the grief, and do not mistake it for a sign that you should turn back. The heaviness you feel is not the collapse of your progress. It is the mourning that accompanies it, the necessary passage between who you were and who you are becoming. Let yourself grieve the old self. Honor what they were and what they gave you. And then, when the mourning has done its work, let them go. Not because they didn't matter, but because you have somewhere to be that they could not take you. The grief will pass. The new self will form. And on the other side of the mourning is the person you were becoming all along, waiting for you to finish the difficult, sacred work of letting the old self die. Growth feels like grief because growth is, in part, a grief. The grief of a self ending so a truer self can be born. There is nothing wrong with you. You are simply doing the most human thing there is, becoming who you are, and mourning, as you must, everything you have to leave behind to get there. And that mourning, fully felt and moved through, is not the obstacle to your transformation. It is the very path of it, the road that leads, through loss, to a self more fully your own than the one you had to let die.